Wife came downstairs and she was in a bit of a hurry to get out the door on her way to work, and so as she passed through the kitchen, her husband was there having a cup of coffee. He was on his iPad checking out all the sports scores from the weekend, and so as she kind of blew by him, she looked his direction and she said, "Well, I guess you know what special day it is today." And the husband, without missing a beat, said, "I sure do." And then she headed on out the door and got in her car, and off to work she went. And he sat there looking at his iPad and thought, what is today? What is today? And so then he started getting real nervous because she was really excited, special day today, and so he thought, oh my, maybe it's her birthday. And so on his way into work himself, he stopped by a florist and he got 12 white roses and had the florist to deliver them to her workplace later that day. And so she got a dozen white roses. And then as the day went on and as he was sitting in his office, he started wondering a little bit more, and he thought, well, you know, maybe it's our anniversary. And he began to think maybe those roses aren't quite enough, and so he decided on his way home from work he would stop by the store and he would get her her favorite brand of perfume, and he'd get her one of those boxes of Godiva chocolates. Not any chocolates, man, Godiva chocolates, keep that in mind. So he comes in the door, and there he puts the Godiva chocolates right there on the counter, and he puts that perfume, it's all gift wrapped, right there on the counter. His wife comes in, she's got her dozen white roses, and she puts them, and she's already put them in a vase at work, brings them and sits them, and she says, "Oh my, what is this?" And he says, "Well, you know, today's a special day. Today's a special day." And so she goes and she unwraps the box, and there's her favorite brand of perfume, and of course she sees the red box of Godiva chocolates, and he said, "You know, today's a special day." And she looks at him and she says, "You know, this is the best Groundhog Day I've ever had." But today's a special day in the life of our church as we celebrate our centennial. Actually, our centennial, the actual day would have been the second Sunday in January, but some of us thought, you know, the second Sunday of January is not really a good event day. You never know what you're going to get. We could have planned something big time, and then we get ice or snow or whatever. So we thought, you know, let's just do it a little later in the year. We'll do it on a crisp fall day when it's going to be 90 degrees. So anyway, that's what we went with. That's what we went with in our wisdom. And so anyway, so today's a special day in the life of our church, and I want us to look at an autobiographical passage that the Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 3. And he's kind of looking back at his life, kind of taking stock of things, and there are some things that he does, that he communicates in that passage that, you know, are instructive to us at an individual level, as individual believers. You know, these are things that we ought to do, that we ought to reflect upon. But for our purposes today, even though that can be an important takeaway, I want us to also be reminded that, you know, it's important for us as a church, as a congregation, to reflect as well. And so, listen to these words from the Apostle Paul, and then we'll kind of go from there. It says, "Not that I have already obtained all this." Now, the "this" that Paul is referring to is what he has just written about, which is knowing Christ, living daily in the power of Christ, becoming Christ-like. So that is the "this" that he's referring to. So he says, not that I am doing all of those things to the nth degree, not that I've already obtained all of this, or have already been made perfect, but I press on to take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of me. Brothers, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. Philippians chapter 3, man, that's just a great passage where Paul is encouraging the Philippian Christians as he kind of thinks about his own life and his own walk as a Christian. And I want to suggest to you this morning that in that reflecting process, Paul reflects on three things, or he does three things as a part of his reflection. And again, these are things that you and I ought to do at an individual level. But I'm going to suggest this morning that these are things that we as a church ought to do. And so the three things that he does is, first of all, he evaluates. He evaluates. And I'm drawn to that statement there in verse 13 where he says, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it. In other words, Paul is saying, I have not yet arrived. Now, I want you to think about the power of that evaluation, because most scholars believe that the Philippian letter was probably written in the late 50s to early 60s AD, which would mean that Paul had about a decade of ministry under his belt. And when you and I kind of stand back, as Paul is doing here, and think about everything that Paul had accomplished in that decade. I mean, Paul had been on a couple of far-reaching missionary journeys. Paul had started churches. If the churches had been started by others, he was encouraging them through letters and through sending friends of his, like Timothy and others, to those churches to encourage them directly. Paul's letters were being read in churches for the purpose of forming theology and nurturing and discipling new believers. Paul had these kind of dramatic, he'd been in prison and these really dramatic episodes. And so there's a lot that had happened in Paul's life in those 10 years prior to Paul writing what he writes here in Philippians chapter 3. But yet, in the midst of all of that accomplishment, all that body of work, Paul's ultimate evaluation is, I have not yet arrived. And I want to say to us that, one of the most dangerous places you and I can ever park it as a believer is to say to ourselves, I have arrived. The moment we say that, we stop growing. The moment we say that, we stop risking. The moment we come to the conclusion, I have arrived, we stop the maturing process. And we immediately begin to stagnate. That's a dangerous place to be. And I want to suggest to you this morning that that's a dangerous place for the church to be. Because when the church says, you know what, we're debt-free, we've got a beautiful building, we got, a healthy membership, we have arrived, that's where it's going to stagnate immediately. And so one of the things that you and I want to do periodically at an individual level is to do exactly what Paul did, and that is to kind of evaluate, take stock of what we have done in and through Jesus Christ, where we are at the moment in our walk and journey of faith, and then casting an eye to the future, so we evaluate. This morning, and I'm not going to give you this information to impress you. I'm going to give you this information because we need to be challenged, but I want to suggest to you that the American church is not doing well. And I think a lot of it is due to this, well, we've arrived. All is good. And there's a stagnation that has set in that is very dangerous. So I'm going to give you some statistics this morning down in that little gray box at the bottom of your worship bulletin. I was just going to give them to you, but I kind of wanted to make it fill in the blank because these statistics are pretty sobering stuff. So if you think Christianity is kind of arrived in America and everything is comfortable in America in terms of the status of the church, here you go. 6,000 churches close every year in the United States. 6,000. If we were to take the membership/attendance decline in the American church and kind of do a little math to it, what it would come out to, what it would equate to is 3,500 people leave the church every day. 90% of young pastors will leave the career before they retire. And that doesn't mean they become a missionary. That's what I'm talking about. 17% of Americans attend church regularly, and regularly is defined by 2 times a month. Only 15% of churches in the United States are growing numerically. That means 85% are either plateaued or declining, and most are declining. They're not plateaued. 800 new church plants survive every year. That's a good thing. But if we're to keep up with the population growth in the United States, 10,000 need to survive. Now again, I'm not offering that to you this morning by way of trying to depress you or to take the wind out of the sail, but I do offer that to say if there is a time for the church to not be comfortable, it's today. If there is a time for the church to not rest on any past successes and to sit back and say, well, you know, we've kind of arrived at, you know, this is good. It is not today. And I want to say to you this morning that on our Centennial Celebration Day, you know, it's good to take moments like this and to kind of evaluate, but we need to do it in the larger context. And if there is ever a time for the church to get legs and to get vocal and to get bold, as Acts calls us to be in the sharing and the proclamation of the gospel, it's today. It's today. So those statistics aren't there to depress you, but they are there to challenge us. To challenge us as a church as we celebrate our centennial. The second thing that Paul does in this reflection process is he eliminates. He eliminates. And we can say in the elimination process, as Paul says, you know, one thing I do, I forget what is behind. Now, we can look at that 2 different ways. Number one, we can say, okay, well, what he's talking about there, forgetting what is behind, is all those past mistakes and all of that past life that he had that certainly he would want to forget, because we know that Paul, of course, persecuted Christians early on. He was pretty zealous about that, and so you know, perhaps that's what Paul is referring to, that I'm forgetting about all of that. That has been laid and given grace and forgiveness by the cross of Jesus Christ, and so I'm going to forget that so I can press ahead. But can I put a little different spin on it this morning? That could have been what he was referring to, but what about if Paul was referring to, you know, all the things that I have done, I'm going to forget so that I can keep moving to the future. Because I want to tell you that sometimes what happens is when there is a body of accomplishment, when there is a body of success, it's really easy for the church to wither in nostalgia. And so as we celebrate our centennial, you know what? We are thankful today for the 100 years of God's faithfulness to us and for the 100 years of ministry and service that we've as a church have been privileged to have. But let us not make the mistake of thinking that the best days of Heights Community Church were yesterday. Because once we get there, that's not a healthy place to be. You've heard me use this illustration before on occasion about the Swiss watchmakers You know, back in the 30s and 40s, the Swiss dominated the global market for timepieces. They had developed to nth precision the measurement of time. They just dominated. And some have estimated that out of all the timepieces, that'd be watches, it would be pocket watches, it would be clocks, that Swiss watchmakers, clockmakers had about a 75 to 80% share of the global market. They were the gold standard. And then what is called the quartz revolution kicked in. And in 1969, the quartz movement was developed to measure time. And it was taken first to Switzerland. And the Swiss Guild, of which all the watchmakers were a part, rejected it. They said, we know what we're doing. We know what's best. We know what works. And we're not interested in quartz technology. By 1970s, the quartz revolution had kicked in, and there were 1,600 Swiss watch companies prior to 1970. By the late 70s, that was down to 600. There were 98,000 people employed in watchmaking in Switzerland in 1970. By the end of the decade, that was down to 20,000. And almost all Swiss watch companies had gone broke. They were in nostalgia. And there was no motivation on their part to adapt or to change or to do anything different. And so they just simply parked it in the past and lost out on the future. Let me give you another illustration. This is a little closer to home. We'll kind of set the Swiss to the side for the moment. A couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, the last surviving cousin of my grandfather, Harris, passed away. Now, her name was Lucy James. She lived in a little place called Unionville up in Orange County in Central Virginia. She went by Bunny, so that's the way I'm going to refer to her. Well, every time Dad, once or twice a year, Dad and I get in the car and we go up, tool around Orange County and, you know, a few places like that. And so we'd always stop by Unionville. We always go visit Bunny. She was a delightful lady. She was a delightful lady. Bunny lived all her life, and she passed away in her mid-90s. She lived all her life in the home she had been born in. She was an only child. She never married, and she was a retired school librarian. And so we would go see her, and she would look forward to our visits. Now, here's the deal. When you would go in Bunny's house, it was frozen in time. When her father passed away, she did not move a thing in that house. So when Dad and I would go into her living room, there was the couch and the easy chair that her parents had bought in the 50s in the living room. A picture did not move. A piece of furniture did not move. A piece of furniture did not ever get reupholstered. When the Zenith console TV that her parents had bought went kaput, and she went over to Orange where they had bought it, and the good folks at Orange said, they don't make Zenith TVs anymore. We can't repair your Zenith TV. You'll have to get a new one. She just sat with a malfunctioning TV in the living room. She was eccentric, yes. She was kind of delightful in a certain way, you know. But she was parked in nostalgia. Nothing changed in that home. There are churches that are parked in nostalgia. And And that's one of the things that is feeding the statistics I just gave us. You know, one of the things that I'm so encouraged about in our church as we celebrate our centennial is that in 2014 was a big year for us. We relaunched the church. We did things new and we did things different. We tried different new things for us as a congregation. And that's great. And we grew and we've gotten dividends from that. But I want to tell you, if 20 years from now we're still doing what we're doing today, and so sometimes when we think about the one thing we need to do is to forget what is behind us, is not necessarily the bad things, but sometimes the successes, because when we get there and when we park it there and when we think our best days are yesterday and not tomorrow and we just rest in nostalgia, that's not where we need to be. You know, the mission never changes, the message never changes, but the methodologies have to change. Just like those Swiss watchmakers. You know, you and I no longer have a need to know what time it is, do we? I need to know what time it is. So the need is still there. The method by which we get time has changed. People still have a need for the gospel of Jesus Christ. That will never change, but the methodology by which the new generations can be reached with that gospel has to change. And you know, the best example I can think of a guy who knew the power of kind of changing and altering and recalibrating methodologies in order to reach people for Jesus Christ was the same person who wrote Philippians chapter 3, it's the Apostle Paul, 2 millennia ago. Here's the deal. In Acts chapter 13, Paul went to Antioch. And the first place he went to Antioch to preach was the synagogue. In fact, most of the time, that's where he went. He went to the synagogue because he knew in the synagogue, that was kind of the epicenter of religious thinking, and that was where a bit of a receptive audience could be had. And so he would always make a beeline for the synagogue in most every town and village that he went. And so that's what he does in Antioch in Acts chapter 13. In Acts 17, he goes to Athens. And he makes a beeline in Athens not to go to the synagogue, but to go to the Areopagus, which was the center where all the philosophers and thinkers would gather to discuss religious and other ideas. And he knew that was the center of influence for Athens. But imagine if Paul had said, well, you know, I only go to synagogues. That's the only place I show up at. I don't mess with this other stuff that's out there. I only go to the synagogue. We would have never had that powerful outcome in Acts 17 if Paul had not gone to where he went in Athens. He switched up his methodology to penetrate a city with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so Paul evaluates, Paul eliminates, and then Paul, and here's the great thing, he expects. He expects. I like what Paul writes. He says, straining toward what is ahead, I press on. I press on. And the word press on literally means I run swiftly. That phrase of running swiftly in terms of the future conveys immediately in the language of Paul an enthusiasm and an energy for what is in front of him. And you know, as we celebrate our centennial, again, we're grateful for the history of 100 years. But what we ought to really be excited about is what's ahead of us. We celebrate the past, but what we really ought to be excited about is what's ahead of us. Yesterday, I was watching college football, and I began with the UVA Notre Dame game. Big day yesterday. Big day yesterday. They were the only two top 20 ranked teams playing each other, but because UVA is obviously a Virginia team, I wanted to, tune in. So I'm watching UVA and Notre Dame, and they're doing their thing. And then One of the commentators on the game said about the third quarter of UVA Notre Dame, he said, "Man, they have got a barn burner in North Carolina." Well, I'm thinking UNC, unranked, is playing Clemson, number one. So I start, channel surfing and get to the Clemson-UNC game, and there it's all locked up at 14 apiece, third quarter. So, pardon